Devon Mitchell and Sarah Mitchell were the couple everyone in Asheville, North Carolina, seemed to know. He was a paramedic, one of those people who were called to emergencies in the middle of the night and saved lives before the sun came up again. She was a pediatric nurse at Mission Hospital, with a smile that could calm even the most anxious little patients. Together, they formed a team that seemed perfect to the outside world. Two paramedics dedicated to caring for others, but who also found time to love each other. Their story began in the fall of 2014, on a rainy October day at Mission Hospital. Devon had just returned from a serious traffic accident, his face still marked by the tension of the call. Sarah was working in the pediatric emergency room and was in the process of comforting a crying 5-year-old with a broken arm. Their eyes met across the hospital corridor, his exhausted but alert, hers gentle but determined. It wasn't love at first sight in the classic sense, but something deeper, an instant recognition between two souls who understood what it meant to work with pain and hope every day. The first months of their relationship were marked by that rare ease that only comes when two people are truly suited to each other. Devon was calm and methodical, a man who kept his cool in crises and whose hands never trembled, no matter how serious the situation. Sarah, on the other hand, was warm-hearted and impulsive, someone who led with her heart and whose empathy was sometimes so overwhelming that she came home crying after exhausting shifts. Devon learned to hold her when the weight of the world became too heavy. Sarah learned to give him space when he was withdrawn after particularly traumatic calls. In the summer of 2016, they were married in a small ceremony at the Biltmore estate, surrounded by the rolling hills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The wedding was intimate, just close family and friends, but the love that filled the room that day was unmistakable. Devon's father, himself a retired firefighter, gave a speech about how his son had finally found someone who understood his quiet strength. Sarah's mother, Akosua, a Ghanaian immigrant who had come to the US in the 1980s, blessed the couple in Twi, the language of her Akan ancestors, and asked the ancestors to protect the young family. The first years of their marriage were, as Devon would later say, the happiest of his life. They bought a small house in West Asheville, a charming craftsman cottage with a wide porch, and a garden that Sarah filled with native plants. Devon built a workshop in the basement where he spent weekends restoring old furniture, a meditative practice that helped him process the stress of his job. Sarah planted herbs and vegetables, often using recipes her mother had given her from Ghana. Their neighbors knew them as the friendly couple who always had a smile and took the time to talk to the neighborhood children. But life had other plans for Devon and Sarah Mitchell. In the spring of 2019, just as they had decided it was time to start a family, Sarah became pregnant. The joy was indescribable. They immediately began transforming the small guest room upstairs into a nursery. Devon painted the walls a soft yellow, neutral, because they didn't want to know the baby's gender beforehand. Sarah bought little baby clothes at the farmer's market in downtown Asheville, hand-knitted hats and soft blankets. But at 12 weeks pregnant on a cold March morning, Sarah started bleeding. Devon drove her to the hospital, his hands clenched white around the steering wheel, while Sarah cried beside him. The doctors at Mission Hospital, their colleagues, their friends, could do nothing. The baby was lost. Medically speaking, the miscarriage was not unusual. Emotionally, it was devastating. Sarah fell into a deep depression. She took 6 weeks off work, but even after that, she seemed like a shadow of her former self. The smile her patients had loved so much was slow to return. Devon tried to be strong. He worked longer shifts, partly because the work distracted him, partly because he didn't know how to comfort Sarah. In his training, he had learned how to splint broken bones and stop bleeding, but no one had taught him how to heal a broken heart. The months passed. Slowly, very slowly, they began to heal. Sarah's mother, Akosua, came from her home in Charlotte to be with them. She cooked Ghanaian dishes, jollof rice, fufu, grilled fish with red sauce, and told Sarah stories from her own youth in Kumasi. In Ghanaian culture, Akosua explained, grief was something that was carried by the community, not by individuals. Sarah began to understand this wisdom. She allowed her mother and Devon to share her burden instead of carrying it alone. In 2020, as the world grappled with the COVID-19 pandemic, Devon and Sarah decided to try again. This time, Sarah was more cautious, almost fearful. She took prenatal vitamins, avoided alcohol and caffeine, and rested more. The first weeks of pregnancy went well, then the first months. At the 20-week ultrasound, they learned they were expecting a girl. Sarah cried with joy. Devon bought a tiny pink dress and hung it proudly over the crib in the nursery. They named her Emma before she was even born, Emma Mitchell. Sarah talked to her, placed her hands on her growing belly, and sang her Ghanaian lullabies she had learned from her mother. Devon read books to her, children's books about animals and adventures. They planned their future, how Emma would take her first steps in this living room, how she would play in the garden, how she might one day visit her grandmother in Ghana. But in February 2021, at 32 weeks pregnant, Emma stopped moving. Sarah noticed it first on a Sunday morning. She was lying in bed, her hand on her belly, waiting for the familiar kicks. Nothing. She tried to stay calm, drank cold water, ate something sweet, tricks to encourage the baby to move. Still nothing. When Devon woke up, he saw the panic in her eyes. They drove to the hospital immediately. The drive felt endless, even though it only took 15 minutes. At Mission Hospital, the same place where they had once fallen in love, where they had saved lives together, they heard the words that would change their lives forever. "We're sorry. We can't find a heartbeat." Emma was dead, still in Sarah's womb, just 8 weeks before her due date. Sarah had to go through labor, knowing that her baby would not breathe. The doctors induced labor. The agony lasted 24 hours, while Devon sat next to her, holding her hand and trying not to cry. When Emma was finally born, she was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a face like a sleeping angel. But she would never wake up. They held her, Devon and Sarah, for 3 hours. They took photos, made footprints, cut a lock of her dark hair. The nurses, Sarah's colleagues, cried with them. Then they had to let her go. A nurse whose name Sarah never learned carried Emma away, wrapped in a pink blanket. Sarah collapsed, a cry that came from the deepest part of her being, a sound Devon would never forget. The funeral was small. They buried Emma at Riverside Cemetery overlooking the French Broad River. Akosua performed a Ghanaian ceremony, poured libations, and called on the ancestors to guide Emma's soul home. Devon couldn't speak. He stood next to the tiny coffin, his hand on Sarah's shoulder, trying to understand how life could be so cruel. In the months that followed, something broke in their marriage. They didn't talk about it, they couldn't. Sarah threw herself into her work, obsessively caring for sick children in the hospital, as if she could save Emma by saving others. Devon did the same, taking double shifts, sometimes working 60 hours a week. When they were at home, they moved past each other like ghosts, each trapped in their own grief. Sarah's mother urged her to go to therapy. Sarah went twice and then stopped. Devon never went. He said he didn't need help, that he could handle it, but he couldn't. He started having bad dreams. Dreams of missions that went wrong, of children he couldn't save, of Emma waking up in his arms and then dying again. He didn't talk to anyone about it. The nursery remained untouched, the pink walls, the crib, the little dress. Sarah couldn't go in there without breaking down. Devon closed the door and didn't open it again for a year. The house that had once been so full of life grew quiet. The neighbors noticed the change, but didn't mention it. In a small community like West Asheville, everyone knew about Emma, and everyone respected the Mitchells' pain. But then, in the winter of 2022, something unexpected happened. Sarah, who had almost given up hope, discovered she was pregnant again. She didn't tell Devon right away. She waited, took 3 different tests, went to the doctor to have it confirmed. When she was sure, she sat down with him on the sofa one evening and showed him the ultrasound. Devon looked at the blurry image, the tiny, bean-shaped figure, and burst into tears for the first time since Emma's death. This time, Sarah was more cautious than she had ever been. She took unpaid leave from work. She went to every appointment and had weekly checkups. Devon reduced his shifts to be with her. They didn't talk much about their fears. It was as if saying them out loud might make them come true. But they were always there, a silent burden they both carried. The weeks passed, then the months. 20 weeks, the mark at which they had lost Emma. 32 weeks, the week Emma had died. Each milestone was a victory and an agony. But the baby remained strong. The heart rate was good, the movements were regular, the doctors said everything looked normal. In the spring of 2023, Sarah and Devon cautiously began to hope again. They decided that this time they wanted to know the sex. At the ultrasound, they learned they were expecting a boy. Devon smiled genuinely for the first time in years. A boy. They wouldn't be able to name him Emma, but they would honor her memory. They decided that his middle name would be Emma, in memory of the sister he would never know. To celebrate their new hope and share it with their community, they planned a gender reveal party combined with a traditional baby shower. It was going to be a big event, a way to show everyone that they had survived the darkness. They rented decorations, planned a menu, and invited friends and family. The celebration was set for July 15th, 2023, a Saturday afternoon in their backyard in West Asheville. And then, 2 months before the celebration, Kofi Mensah arrived from Ghana. Kofi was the son of Akosua's younger sister, Ama. He was 26 years old, had completed his engineering degree at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, and had come to Charlotte on a Fulbright scholarship to pursue his master's degree in civil engineering. Akosua had invited him to stay with her, but Kofi, curious about his cousin Sarah's life, began visiting her in Asheville on weekends. Sarah was delighted to meet Kofi. He reminded her of the Ghanaian side of her family, which she hadn't seen since childhood. Kofi spoke Twi, cooked Ghanaian dishes, and told stories from Accra that reminded Sarah of her own visits to Ghana as a child. Devon liked Kofi too. He was polite, intelligent, and always willing to help. When Devon mentioned that they needed help preparing for the gender reveal party, Kofi immediately offered to help. What no one suspected at the time was that Kofi's presence would set off a chain of events that would end in tragedy. In the weeks to come, the distance between Devon and Sarah would grow, old wounds would reopen, and a connection would form that should never have existed. The perfect American family was on the brink of disaster, and they didn't even know it. July 15, 2023 was supposed to be a day of joy. Instead, it would be remembered as the day everything fell apart, the day blood spilled across the wooden floors of their home, and the day 3 lives were destroyed forever. But that came later. At first there was only hope, fragile, fearful, but still there, that this time everything would be all right. Kofi Mensah came to Asheville for the first time in May 2023, on a warm Friday afternoon when the rhododendrons were in full bloom and the city was bathed in pink and white. Sarah picked him up from the bus stop downtown, and when she saw him, tall, slim, with her mother's familiar dark complexion and high cheekbones, she felt an unexpected wave of emotion. He was a piece of Ghana here in North Carolina, a living connection to a part of herself she had long neglected. Kofi was from Accra, Ghana's vibrant capital, where he had grown up in the Osu neighborhood. His mother, Ama, Akosua's younger sister, was a teacher at a public school, and his father was an electrician who ran his own small business. Kofi was the eldest of 4 children, raised in a modest apartment near Oxford Street, where the noise of the trotros, the crowded minibuses, and the cries of street vendors formed the soundtrack of his childhood. He had worked his way through the Ghanaian education system through hard work and talent, earning honors in mathematics and physics in high school, and eventually being accepted to the prestigious Kwame Nkrumah University in Kumasi. In Ghana, Kofi had dreamed of America like so many young Africans, but his dreams were not naive. He knew that life in the United States was complex, full of opportunities, but also full of challenges for someone like him, a young black man with an accent that immediately marked him as a foreigner. When the Fulbright scholarship came, an opportunity granted to only a few applicants, he accepted it with a mixture of pride and caution. The first few weeks in Charlotte had been overwhelming. The city was huge, impersonal, so different from the communal life in Accra. He missed the familiar sounds of home, the early morning calls to prayer, the laughter of neighbors on their porches, the spicy aroma of banku and okro soup wafting through the streets. His aunt Akosua was friendly but busy with her own life. She worked as a nurse in a nursing home and was often away for long hours. Kofi spent most evenings alone in her guest room, studying for his classes and talking on the phone with his family in Ghana. Then came the invitation to visit Sarah in Asheville. Akosua had told him a lot about her daughter, how she worked as a nurse, how she had recently suffered terrible losses, how she was now pregnant again and cautiously hopeful. Kofi was curious. He had met Sarah once as a child, at a family gathering in Kumasi in the early 2000s, but the memory was vague. Now she was a grown woman, married, leading a life that was completely foreign to him. The first weekend in West Asheville was a revelation. Sarah and Devon welcomed him warmly. Their house was cozy, full of plants and photographs, and Sarah cooked a mix of American and Ghanaian cuisine that first evening. Grilled chicken with jollof rice, which Kofi described as the best he had eaten outside of Ghana. Devon was friendly, if a little reserved. He asked polite questions about Kofi's studies, about Ghana, about his plans for the future. Kofi sensed that Devon was a good man, but also someone who struggled with himself. Sarah, on the other hand, opened up quickly. She told Kofi about Emma, about the pain that still burned in her heart, about her fear of this new pregnancy. Kofi listened, as he had been taught to do, with the patience and respect that Ghanaian culture teaches toward elders and those who are suffering. In Ghana, he explained to Sarah, it was believed that death was not the end, but a transition. Emma was now with the ancestors, he said, and she would watch over her family. These words, spoken with the sincerity of a young man who believed in them, moved Sarah to tears. In the weeks that followed, Kofi's visits became a habit. He came to Asheville every other Friday, stayed for the weekend, and drove back to Charlotte on Sunday evenings. He helped around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, building shelves in the basement, helping Devon paint the porch. The neighbors noticed the young Ghanaian man who was so often at the Mitchell's house, and some asked curious questions. Sarah proudly explained that Kofi was her cousin, family, and the neighbors nodded understandingly. What no one, not even Sarah herself, realized at first was how much she needed Kofi's presence. Devon was physically present, but emotionally absent. He worked long shifts, came home exhausted, and often sank into silence. When Sarah tried to talk to him about her fears, about her hopes for the baby, he nodded, said the right things, but his eyes were empty. It was as if a part of him had died with Emma and never returned. Kofi, on the other hand, was present. He asked questions. Real questions. How are you feeling today? What scares you? What brings you joy? He told her about Ghana, about the importance of family in Akan culture, about the rituals that intertwined life and death. They began taking long walks through French Broad River Park, Sarah with her hand on her growing belly, Kofi by her side, talking about everything and nothing. The closeness grew unnoticed, like ivy on a wall. It was the little things: Kofi's hand on Sarah's back as she climbed stairs, Sarah touching Kofi when he laughed, the way their eyes met and lingered a few seconds too long. Devon didn't notice. He was too caught up in his own world, in his shifts, in his nightmares, in his inability to talk about Emma. In early July, 2 weeks before the planned gender reveal party, Kofi stayed in Asheville for a whole week. His semester program had a break, and Sarah had asked him to help prepare the decorations. Devon worked night shifts, came home in the morning, slept until the afternoon, and then went back to work. That meant Sarah and Kofi were often alone during the day. They bought blue and pink balloons, hung garlands, planned the menu, but they also spent hours just talking. Sarah told Kofi things she had never told Devon: how guilty she felt about Emma, how she wondered if she could have done something differently, how alone she felt, even in her own marriage. Kofi told Sarah about his own loneliness in America, the pressure to succeed, his fear of failing and disappointing his family in Ghana. One evening, after a particularly emotional conversation, they sat on the porch, drinking hibiscus tea that Kofi had made according to a Ghanaian recipe, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Sarah rested her head on Kofi's shoulder for a moment. It was an innocent gesture, a moment of connection, but it was also a boundary violation. They both felt it. The night before Kofi was due to return to Charlotte, neither of them could sleep. Sarah lay next to the sleeping Devon, staring at the ceiling and wondering what was happening to her. Kofi lay in the guest room upstairs, the same room that had once been intended for Emma, trying to sort out his thoughts. He knew that what he felt for Sarah was wrong. She was married, she was his cousin, his family, and yet he couldn't stop thinking about her. The gender reveal party was scheduled for July 15th. In the 2 weeks leading up to it, Sarah and Kofi exchanged text messages every day. At first, they were practical things, details about the party, who would bring what. Then the messages became more personal. Good night, followed by heart emojis. I'm thinking of you. I miss our conversations. Devon, still caught up in his work, didn't notice anything. And so July 15th approached, a day that was supposed to begin with balloons and laughter and the revelation of a gender, but would end in screams and blood and irreversible loss. But in those last days of innocence, as Sarah and Kofi became aware of their growing connection and Devon remained oblivious, disaster still seemed avoidable. It was not. The cracks in the foundation were already too deep, and the house, metaphorically and literally, was on the verge of collapse. Sabine Keller stood at the panoramic window of her apartment in Munich's Schwabing district and looked out over the city's rooftops. The morning sun bathed the Bavarian capital in golden light, and the silhouette of the Alps stood out on the horizon. At 32, she had reached a point in her life that she had only dreamed of as a young girl. Her architecture firm was thriving. She had just won a prestigious contract to renovate a historic building in Maxvorstadt, and by her side was Marcus Lindner, the man who had completely changed her life 4 years ago. Marcus worked as an independent financial advisor, specializing in wealthy private clients. His company, Lindner Financial Solutions, was based in a modern office building on Viktualienmarkt. He was eloquent, charming, and his clients raved about his ability to explain even complicated financial products in an understandable way. Sabine still remembered their first encounter vividly. It had been at a networking event, organized by the Munich Chamber of Commerce and Industry, one of those evenings she hadn't really wanted to attend. Marcus had approached her, first talking about architecture, then about travel, music, life. His green eyes had crinkled with laughter, and his manner of speaking had been direct yet respectful. Today, on this May morning in 2022, Sabine was setting the breakfast table while Marcus was still in the shower. She turned on the coffee machine, cut open fresh rolls from the bakery, and arranged jam, honey, and cheese on the table. Through the open bathroom door, she heard the sound of running water and hummed quietly to herself. In 3 weeks, they would go on vacation together to Lake Constance, as they did every year. It had become their tradition. Hiking in the mountains around the lake, swimming in the clear water, sitting in small restaurants in the evening and reviewing the day. But if Sabine was honest with herself, she had noticed something in recent months that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Small changes in Marcus's behavior. Nothing dramatic, nothing that needed to be discussed directly, but enough to cause a slight unease in an attentive partner. It was the phone calls he took in the next room, the sudden nervousness when the mail arrived, the way he sometimes woke up in the middle of the night and went to the window, staring intently at the street. Once, she had asked him if everything was okay, and he had just nodded, pulled her close, and said that work was stressful at the moment. New clients, complicated portfolios, the usual challenges of being self-employed. Marcus came out of the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his hips, his hair still damp. He was 35 years old and had an athletic build, which he maintained by running regularly and occasionally climbing at the Munich bouldering gym. Climbing was his great passion. He had already undertaken his first tours in the Alps as a teenager, and even today he still regularly drove to the mountains on weekends. Sabine herself was not so enthusiastic about climbing, but sometimes accompanied him on easier hikes. They had breakfast together and talked about the day ahead. Sabine had a meeting with a new client, and Marcus casually mentioned a meeting with a long-standing customer. Everything seemed normal, routine, familiar, and yet there was something in the air, a tension that Sabine couldn't put her finger on. When Marcus put down his coffee cup, she noticed that his hand was trembling slightly. It was a barely perceptible twitch, but she saw it. She wanted to say something, but he was already getting up, kissing her on the forehead and disappearing into the bedroom to get dressed. While Marcus got ready, Sabine cleared the table and let her gaze wander around the apartment. They had bought this 4-room apartment in an old building 2 years ago and had renovated and furnished it together. Every square meter bore their joint signature. The open kitchen with the custom-made cabinets that Sabine had designed herself, the living room with its high ceilings and restored stucco, the study they shared with 2 desks on opposite walls. It was their home, their safe haven, the place where they could relax after a hard day. What Sabine didn't know as she loaded the dishes into the dishwasher was that Marcus Lindner was standing in that very study at that very moment, looking at a locked folder hidden deep in his filing cabinet. A folder whose contents would bring his carefully constructed life crashing down like a house of cards if it came to light. Inside were reminders, demands for payment, letters from lawyers, and a detailed list of his debts. The total amounted to 380,000 euros, a figure so surreal that Marcus himself sometimes doubted whether it could be real. How had it come to this? Marcus asked himself this question every day. It had started about 2 years ago, innocently enough. A client, a successful entrepreneur from the west of Munich, had asked him to invest a large sum in equity funds. Marcus had developed a strategy that seemed brilliant at first glance. But then the pandemic hit, and the markets crashed. The client lost a significant portion of his assets. Instead of accepting the losses, Marcus made a fatal mistake. He tried to offset the losses with riskier investments without informing the client. The situation worsened. Further losses followed. The client threatened to take legal action. Marcus appeased him, promised to make everything right, and then made his second mistake. He took money from other clients to fill the gaps. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, born not out of criminal intent, but out of desperation and the irrational hope that the markets would recover and he could put everything back in order. But the markets did not recover quickly enough, and the debts grew. Soon, claims from banks that had given him loans were added to the mix. Private loans from acquaintances that he had taken out under false pretenses, bills from suppliers that he could not pay. Marcus had tried to find a way out. He had considered filing for bankruptcy, but that would have meant destroying his career, losing his good reputation, and worst of all, having to tell Sabine the truth. How could he explain to his wife that he, the financial expert who helped other people grow their money, was himself sinking into a swamp of debt? How could he tell her that the apartment they had lovingly furnished together could possibly be seized if the creditors got serious? In recent weeks, Marcus's despair had condensed into a kind of cold clarity. He saw no way out. The creditors were becoming more aggressive, the deadlines shorter, the threats more concrete. One of his clients, a wealthy businessman with connections to the Munich underworld, had made it unmistakably clear that his patience was not unlimited. Marcus had started researching on the internet at night. First, he looked for legal solutions. Then, when he couldn't find any, he looked for other options. He read articles about people who had disappeared and assumed new identities. He came across forums discussing forged documents. And finally, he found a story about a man who had faked his own death. The idea took hold in his mind like a virus. At first, he had dismissed it as absurd. Then he considered it a theoretical possibility. Finally, he saw it as his only way out. The plan took shape. The Lake Constance vacation would be the perfect opportunity. The mountains around the lake were known for their climbing routes, but also for their dangers. Falls happened time and again, and bodies were not always found. If he did it right, it would look like a tragic accident. Sabine would mourn, but she would go on living without having to bear the shame of his debts. His life insurance would give her financial security, and he himself could start over somewhere new, maybe in Austria, maybe further away. The only person he could confide in was his brother Stefan. Stefan Lindner was 3 years younger than Marcus, worked as an IT specialist in Vienna, and had always had a certain penchant for the unconventional. When Marcus told him about his situation, Stefan was silent at first, then took a deep breath and finally said, "If you really want to go through with this, it has to be perfect. One mistake, and you'll end up in prison." They had started to make plans. Stefan would get hold of false documents, rent a small apartment in Vienna, and provide financial support for the first few months. Marcus would go into hiding in Austria, build a new identity for himself, and perhaps later move further abroad. On this May morning, while Sabine stood in the kitchen thinking about their upcoming vacation, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at a hand-drawn map of the Lake Constance region. He had marked a specific route, a via ferrata on the Sentis, that was considered challenging but not overly dangerous. There was a section where the path forked. One side led to the summit, the other to a less frequented route. There, according to his plan, he would stage an accident. His equipment would be left behind, traces of a fall, but no body. Mountain rescue would search, but in the rough terrain, it was not uncommon for missing persons to never be found. Marcus knew his plan was monstrous. He knew it would cause Sabine unimaginable suffering. But in his twisted logic, it was the lesser evil. Better for her to mourn a dead husband than to remain married to a cheater and a failure. Better that she believed in a tragic accident than learn the truth about his criminal activities. He would spare her this shame. At least, that's what he told himself, even though the guilt was already weighing heavily on his chest. Sabine came into the study, a coffee cup in her hand. She placed it on his desk and kissed him on the temple. "I'm going to the office now. See you tonight?" Marcus nodded, forcing himself to smile. "Of course. I'll cook tonight, I promise." She laughed. "You said that last Wednesday too, and then we ended up ordering pizza." "This time I mean it," he said. "I found a new recipe. Pasta with shrimp. Your favorite dish." Sabine stroked his hair. "I'm looking forward to it. See you later, darling." When the apartment door closed behind her, Marcus let his head fall into his hands. He felt tears burning in his eyes, but suppressed them. There was no room for emotions anymore, only for planning, precision, execution. In 3 weeks, his old life would end. In 3 weeks, Marcus Lindner would die, and with him, the truth about his debts, his despair and his cowardice would be buried. At least that's what he thought. Because what Marcus couldn't have known at that moment was that the modern world, with its social networks, digital footprints, and relentless transparency, would not keep secrets forever. The truth, as a wise person once said, always comes to light. Sometimes it just takes longer than expected. July 15th, 2023, began like a dream. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the first guests had already arrived to help with the final preparations. The Mitchells' garden had been transformed. Blue and pink balloons floated everywhere, banners reading "Boy or Girl" hung between the trees, and a table was filled with cupcakes with colored fillings that would reveal the baby's gender. Sarah wore a white summer dress that gently enveloped her belly. She was 26 weeks pregnant, and the baby was moving constantly, as if it knew this was a special day. Devon, in a light blue shirt, played the perfect host, grilling chicken and burgers, pouring lemonade, laughing with old friends from the hospital. Kofi helped out everywhere, but he avoided looking at Sarah for too long. The guilt from last night weighed heavily on him. At 3:30 p.m., everyone gathered in the garden. Sarah and Devon stood in front of a large black box filled with balloons. On 3, they would open the lid. The crowd counted along. 1, 2, 3! The balloons rose, a sea of blue. A boy! The guests cheered. Devon hugged Sarah, tears in his eyes. For a moment, everything was perfect. But at 4:15 p.m., Devon noticed that Sarah was gone. Kofi was nowhere to be seen either. He asked neighbors, friends. No one had seen them. An uneasy feeling crept up his spine. He went into the house and called for Sarah. No answer. He climbed the stairs, his heart pounding. The door to the guest room, Emma's room, was ajar. Devon pushed it open. What he saw shattered his world. Sarah, her dress pulled up, Kofi, his shirt open, their bodies entwined on the bed. They froze, eyes wide with horror. Devon couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel, a rage so pure and burning that it extinguished everything else. "Devon," Sarah began, but the word died in her throat. The party downstairs continued. No one heard Devon close the door behind him. No one suspected that 3 lives were ending at that moment, even though only one of them would die. The first 3 seconds were silence, total, unbearable silence. Devon stood in the doorway, his brain trying to process what his eyes were seeing. Sarah on the bed, Kofi on top of her, both half undressed, the room that had been Emma's, the room where his daughter should have been sleeping. Then the world exploded. "Get out!" Devon said, his voice barely a whisper but deadly. "Get out of this room. Get out of this house." Kofi rose hastily, trying to button his shirt. "Devon, please, let me explain." "Explain?" Devon's voice broke. "You want to explain to me how you were with my pregnant wife in my dead daughter's room?" He couldn't finish the sentence. The anger rose like bile in his throat. Sarah cried, pulling down her dress. "Devon, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "How long?" Devon stepped closer, his hands clenching into fists. "How long?" Kofi tried to get to the door, but Devon blocked his way. "Let me through, please." "Answer me!" Devon was shouting now, and the conversations downstairs fell silent. "How long?" "It didn't mean anything," Sarah stammered. "It was a mistake, just—" "Nothing?" Devon laughed, a terrible sound. "Our baby is in there." He pointed to her belly. "And you—" His voice failed him. Kofi took a step toward the door. Devon pushed him back. Kofi stumbled against the bed. "I'm leaving, okay? I'm just leaving. You're not going anywhere." Devon looked around the room, his eyes falling on the heavy crystal lamp on the nightstand. A gift from Sarah's mother. He grabbed it. "Devon, no!" Sarah jumped up, trying to stop him. He pushed her aside, not hard, but firmly. She fell onto the bed, screaming. Kofi raised his hands. "Brother, please! I'm not your brother!" Devon raised the lamp. "You destroyed my family." What happened next took maybe 10 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Devon swung. Kofi tried to block. The lamp hit his head with a terrible sound. Kofi fell. Devon struck again, and again. Sarah's screams mingled with the noise from downstairs, guests running up the stairs, voices calling for emergency services. When the door burst open, Devon was standing over Kofi, the lamp still in his hand, both of them covered in blood. Sarah's hands were on her stomach, her face a mask of horror. Someone shouted, "Oh my God, call an ambulance!" But Devon, a paramedic with 10 years of experience, already knew. Kofi Mensah would not leave this room alive. The paramedics who arrived at 4:47 p.m. were Devon's colleagues, Marcus and Jennifer, with whom he had worked hundreds of shifts. They saw him standing there, blood on his hands, and knew immediately that their friend was lost forever. Kofi Mensah was pronounced dead at 5:05 p.m. Massive skull trauma, cerebral hemorrhage. The medical examiner would later determine that the first blow had already been fatal. The others had been superfluous rage. Devon was led away in handcuffs. He didn't say a word, didn't fight back. Sarah, examined by paramedics, had a nervous breakdown. She was taken to Mission Hospital, the same hospital where she and Devon had fallen in love, where Emma had died. The baby survived, but Sarah remained under observation for 3 days. Devon Mitchell's trial began in November 2023. The prosecution sought second-degree murder. The defense argued crime of passion, post-traumatic stress disorder due to Emma's death, diminished responsibility in the heat of the moment. Sarah had to testify. She told everything: the emotional affair, the loneliness, the moment in the room. Her voice broke several times. The jury took 4 days, guilty of manslaughter. On January 18, 2024, Devon was sentenced to 18 years in prison. Sarah moved to Raleigh. On March 23, 2024, she gave birth to a healthy boy, Jackson Devon Mitchell. She named him after his father, despite everything, or perhaps because of it. In Ghana, the Mensah family mourned. Kofi's mother, Amma, flew to North Carolina to bring her son's body home. She never spoke to Sarah. Some wounds are too deep for forgiveness. Devon is in the central prison in Raleigh. He writes letters to Sarah that he never sends. In one, he writes, "I saved the life I loved most by taking another. How can I live with that?" Sarah looks at Jackson. His eyes are Devon's color. His smile reminds her of Kofi, and wonders when she will tell him the truth. That he was conceived at a party that ended in a nightmare. That his father is in prison for murdering a man who might be his biological father. The gender reveal party of 2023 is still whispered about in Asheville. The perfect American family that fell apart in an instant. A reminder that cracks can lurk beneath any perfect facade. And sometimes it only takes a single moment, a single mistake, for everything to end in blood and ruins.